Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Katie Rowley, and I am with Shannan Lewinski and Tracy Gill, and we are going to be talking about best webinar practices. This is kind of part of the library's Summer Library Challenge, so we hope you all at NOAA are participating in that as well. But first off, with especially the times we are going through right now with a lot of mandatory telework, webinars have become the very popular practice. And so we hope this is helpful for you. We hope this gives you some ideas or gives you some confidence to either host or be a speaker on a webinar, or to really just kind of be the best audience you can be. So first up, we're gonna have Shannan speaking, but before we get started, I'm going to go through some logistics. You can ask questions using the chat or the question panel. If you have audio issues or if you have a question as we go along pertaining to the content, please place those in the question and chat panel. We do have a couple polls coming up that we would love for you to participate in. And if you are having any audio issues or visual issues, try logging in and logging out and then logging back in. That usually fixes most of those. Okay, so our agenda is to talk about the best practices and tips, first with hosting a webinar, then being a webinar presenter, and finally participating in a webinar. And with that, I'm going to launch our first poll. So everyone should be able to see this poll that should take over your screen right now. And we wanted to know how many webinars you have hosted in the last 3 to 6 months. Okay, I'm seeing about 74% of you, 73 have hosted 0 to 3. We've got about 8% that have done 10 or more, 16% that have done 4 to 6. Awesome. Thank you guys so much. And I hope you can't hear that train in the background. Okay, I see we've had about 75% of you have voted. So I am going to close this poll. Thank you all for participating in that. Okay, so first up is going to be Shannan Lewinski, and I'm gonna leave it to you, Shannan.
Hello, everybody. As Tracy said, my name is Shannan Lewinski, and for the last 13 years, I've been an instructional designer and learning specialist with NOAA's Office for Coastal Management. And one of the focus areas of my position is to design virtual meetings, trainings, workshops, and webinars, which is why I was asked to come and speak to you today. So next slide, please. So today we're going to focus on the best practices and tips for how to design and conduct a successful webinar. Think of webinar design and execution as a process that kind of involves four main areas. You want to plan ahead of the webinar. You want to make sure you take care of some pre-webinar tasks. And then there are some things you need to do during the actual delivery of the webinar, and then items that need to be completed post-webinar. So next slide, please. So now that you've decided that you want to host a webinar, the first step is going to be to identify the target audience or who you're trying to reach with this webinar. So this step is important because it's the main driver for the content and then how you design that webinar. So next slide, please. Okay, so after you've identified your target audience, then it's time to think about the objective or the focus of this webinar. So what is it that you want your target audience to walk away knowing or being able to do? So for example, the objective or focus of this webinar we're doing today is to provide you with best practices and tips for how to design and conduct a successful webinar. So again, you've identified your audience, now you've got your objective and focus. Next slide. So now it's time to identify who's going to facilitate or moderate your webinar, identify a webinar producer, and then the people you feel have the expertise to be guest speakers based on the objective or focus of your webinar. But first I want to kind of talk about the producer. Some folks may not be familiar with the term producer, especially if you're kind of new to doing kind of virtual meetings and webinars. So this is the person that runs behind the virtual platform. So some of the tasks this person assists with include troubleshooting technical issues, maybe opening up a poll or monitoring the chat box for questions. Some of the things that Katie's doing. So kind of today, Katie's kind of our producer for part of today's session. It's ideal to have both a facilitator and a producer, but reality is that there may not be enough staff available to assist with both of these roles. So someone might have to try to juggle both roles, which Katie is doing for us today. So back to guest speakers. After you identify who you'd like to speak, you need to reach out and see if they're willing to present and when they're available. And generally, the best practice, I try to figure out a few dates that the facilitator and producer are available, and then provide those dates to the guest speaker along with the invite to see if those will work for them. So after you nail down the date with your guest speakers, it's important that the facilitator, producer, and guest speakers all play a role in the planning and design of your webinar. So now I'm going to turn it over to Tracy Gill to talk about outreach and promotion of your webinar.
Hi, this is Tracy. So you might not, your webinar might not be open, and you might already have a list of your webinar attendees, but if your webinar is open to anyone, you really need to promote it. Try to get the webinar information out at least a few weeks before in advance. Post it on lists and websites, send it out to colleagues that might be interested. And if you can, post it on social media in your special interest groups if you have that option. Some offices and organizations allow it and some don't. And then remember to send a reminder email a day before. Some webinar services will send a reminder for you. Back to Shannon.
Okay, so next slide. All right, so after you've done your promotion and you're going back to thinking about designing your webinar, it's recommended that you use a virtual process agenda. So a virtual process agenda is different than a process agenda that most of you might have seen for an in-person kind of meeting. The virtual process agenda has 3 columns. There's one for the time. The middle column is for the facilitator and presenters to add talking points for themselves so that they kind of know what they want to focus on, and you can kind of break the webinar down into parts. That way you can kind of keep track of time for each of those kind of talking points or parts of the webinar. And then that third column on the right, that is the part that makes this process agenda different. This is the column for the producer, and this is where you identify any interactive elements that the producer needs to execute during your webinar, like opening up polls, maybe adding a resource link to the chat box. So basically, this document helps everyone who's involved in the webinar know who's doing what and when, and keeping the webinar on time. But you need to make sure it's clear who's going to monitor the time as you're going through the webinar, and how you plan to handle if somebody goes over their designated time, because sometimes people get to be chatty, so you need to have a plan for how you're going to kind of cut that person off and kind of keep things rolling. Next slide, please. Okay, so as you design or select the interactive elements to be used in the webinar, you want to keep in mind the objective and the focus of the webinar, as well as the capabilities of whatever platform your organization uses. So we all know there's lots of platforms out there. They all offer different things, but if you have the tools available like polls, chat boxes, whiteboards, they're great ways of gathering feedback and getting input from your webinar participants. Just make sure that the interactive elements you choose to use get put in that third column of that process agenda when they need to be used, so your producer knows when to pull up those items and what exactly you need during that particular time of the webinar to keep it interactive, engaging, and kind of, again, moving forward. But another thing to consider as you design is thinking about 508 compliance. Does your organization have the opportunity to provide closed captioning for your webinar? Are your PowerPoint slides designed so that a screen reader can be used? So each organization is different on what they have access to and their standards for 508 compliance. So you'll need to check with your organization to kind of see what those things are, but do keep that in mind. Next slide, please.
Give me 1 second, Shannon. Sorry about that.
Actually, we have a poll before we go to our next slide.
Perfect. Let me launch that for everyone.
Okay, so we want to know how you feel about webcams. Do you use your webcams during a webinar? Yes, no, or sometimes?
Okay, we've got about 60% of you have voted. And the reigning answer right now is sometimes.
Okay, that's
52% sometimes, 33% yes, and 15% are saying no. And
okay.
how we define webcams for this context would be that the speaker is using a webcam to point at themselves as they give the information.
Yes.
Okay, so with that, we've got about 70% of people have voted. So I am going to give that another couple seconds. I am getting some feedback that some people can't click into the webcam poll, and that is unfortunate, and I am sorry about that. I'm going to, we've reached 72%, and I'm going to close this poll so we can keep it moving. Okay, the poll is closed, and I believe this is the slide you wanted, Shannon.
Yes, ma'am, it is. Okay, so now that we've kind of talked about webcam use, I kind of want us to think about planning for participant bandwidth, and webcams do play a role in bandwidth. So you need to have, there's some considerations that you kind of have to think through when you're thinking about participant bandwidth. Everybody's working from home now, so we have no idea, what people's internet speed is, the equipment that they have available to them. So we want to make sure that we plan to create a good audio and visual experience for them. So if you choose to use webcams and maybe just the presenters on webcam, and people start complaining that their audio is cutting in and out, the best thing to do is just have your presenter then shut off the webcam, because webcams do use a lot more bandwidth than just logging into the platform and showing the slides. So if, again, the audio is cutting in and out, one of your first troubleshooting tips is just have that presenter shut off the webcam. And if you're, as a backup plan, if you want to have a headshot ready of your presenter, you can pop that up there so that you can have that in lieu of your webcam. But another approach is to use headshots of presenters in lieu of using webcams. So if your platform allows for, you can have the headshot of the presenter up in the corner along with your PowerPoint slides if you're concerned about bandwidth. But it's also another option if you have presenters that maybe don't feel comfortable being on camera. Then again, like I said, you've got that headshot so that people can see who's speaking, but yet also still be able to see the slides. And then when you're thinking about audio for your participants, if it's possible, have a backup conference call line available if you have a participant that can't get their microphone hooked up, if you are using microphones for your participants. Or if you have a presenter and their microphone cuts out during the webinar, then you have that backup conference call line for them. If you're using microphones with participants and the microphone goes out and there's no backup conference call line available, because some platforms don't offer that, then they can just go into listen-only mode, which is what you're in now. You have no microphone, but you can still hear and participate via the chat box. If for some reason you have a participant that keeps getting kicked out of your virtual platform due to bandwidth issues, they keep logging back in, getting kicked out, and they put a note in the chat box like, hey, I keep getting kicked out. A good best practice is just to say, we're recording this session, and offer them a recording afterwards. So that way then they can just exit out of the session, still feel like they're going to get the recording later, and they're not feeling frustrated because they're popping in and out, not hearing everything. So these are just a few ways you can kind of prepare yourself for potential issues that participants might have because of various bandwidth. Okay, next slide. We're seeing the poll right now. Okay, there we go. Okay, so now we've moved on from planning. So we've got ourselves all planned ahead and we've thought through all of our interactive elements and everybody knows who's doing what and when. So now we want to schedule a technology check or dry run, and that should include your presenters, the facilitator, and the producer. So make sure that everyone's using the equipment that they plan to use the day of the webinar. Because it's good to test the virtual platform, hook up the audio, test your webcams. But if they do that on a computer during the dry run and then go use a different computer the day of the webinar, it can cause major problems. Things that can happen, and I've actually seen happen, they can't open the software, or maybe they don't have a microphone on the other machine that they chose to use, that not during the test run. So again, during the test run, it's very important that they're using the same equipment they plan to use on the day of that webinar. So after everyone is in your virtual platform, so your producer, your presenters, everybody's in there, facilitator, everybody's audio is all connected, you've got webcams on, everybody's kind of tested everything. It's time to run through that virtual process agenda, because you want to make sure that everything in that virtual room is set up correctly. Everyone's clear on who's doing what when. You kind of think through the timing and make sure that the timing and the flow of your webinar looks good. And then it's time to discuss your plan A and your plan B for things things like the presenter loses audio, or heaven forbid the producer gets kicked out of the virtual platform. Are you going to do you have a plan for somebody else who can open the polls, or who knows what to do? So it's just good to be prepared for the worst, so things can be fixed quickly in the background and you can still provide your participants with a really great experience. So next slide. So another pre-webinar task, and Tracy mentioned this earlier, is to send out an event reminder along with login instructions. And if you have a virtual platform that sends the reminder out and it's auto-generated, it's usually good to send it 24 hours in advance. But if you have to do it manually, again, 24 hours in advance, make sure you include things like the time, how to log in, and any other instructions you feel that might help them get onto that platform easily. Kind of what I have on the screen, I know it's a little hard to read. I use Adobe Connect a lot, and so these are the instructions that I provide. I've got the meeting room link. I tell them what the audio expectation is, and in this case, they were going to use a microphone, so I kind of give them some steps on how to hook up their microphone. And then at the bottom, I offered an optional conference line, and I just explain, how and when you would use that, so that way people understand that they don't have to use it, but if they do use it, here's how you mute your speakers and etc. So again, make sure pre-webinar event, send the reminder out, and then make sure you have some login and audio instructions for folks, so that creates less confusion and frustration for your participant as they're getting ready to come into your webinar. All right, next please. So now we are here, the day of the webinar has come. So it's the best practice to have that facilitator, presenter, and producer log in at least 20 to 30 minutes ahead of time, because you want to be able to troubleshoot audio, make sure everybody can get in the platform, make sure, presentation's loaded, everything's ready to go. Any last minute logistics that you all want to talk about real quick, any questions anybody has, make sure that those are out of the way, so that way when your participants start logging in, you've got your ducks in a row, and then your producer or whoever is helping with technical issues can focus on getting those participants settled, because your facilitator and presenters, who are very key to your webinar, are all set and ready to go. Next slide. Okay, so now that you've got the day of the webinar, we've got presenters, facilitator, they're all logged in and set to go. If your platform allows for, oftentimes what I do is I have a slide that talks about the audio setup. So people come into the room and the first thing they see is a slide that tells them how the audio will work for that session. So on the slide, you see I have one that's excuse me, for listen only mode. So it's telling you turn on your speakers. There's no microphone or phone line. You're just going to communicate via the chat. That way the participants know, okay, I can hear, and the person who's getting the audio checks done can say, hey, if you can hear me, put a note in the chat box. That way then everybody knows audio is strictly through my computer. The producer's checking to make sure everybody can hear, good to go. But if you decide to use microphones, then again, you've got some troubleshooting tips on here's some things to do to get your microphone set up, and then your producer again kind of does sound checks with people to make sure their microphones are working. And that's again if you want your participants to be able to speak during your webinar. Next slide. So if possible, if your platform allows, have that troubleshooting slide or the audio slide up, and then have kind of an icebreaker or welcome activity on the screen at the same time. So after their audio is hooked up, you can direct them to do this icebreaker welcome activity. And it can be related to the webinar content. It could be more of a pulse check kind of thing, or it could be more of a kind of getting to know you. And I put a couple of examples up. On the left-hand side, I've got a short answer poll that says, today I am feeling, and they're supposed to fill in the blank. It was related to a webinar we were doing related to the COVID-19 situation. And then the other welcome activity or icebreaker that I have on the screen was a chat box one. I put in the chat box, what does risk communication mean to you? Because it was related to a risk communication webinar. So that was webinar related content. And so the trainer then can use that information then kind of to get a feel for what people know, what they're thinking, and then they can use that during the actual webinar as they kind of maybe launch into the content. All right, next slide. All right, so you've got everybody's audio hooked up. You've done your little welcome and icebreaker. Before you start anything, you want to get your participants familiar with the logistics and kind of tools that are going to be used in that virtual platform, because everybody's jumping from platform to platform, and it's hard sometimes to locate where things are. So if you plan on using the raised hand function so that people can actually ask questions because they are using a microphone, show them where that raised hand is. If they're going to be using polls, show them what the polls look like and how to participate in them. You want to show them how to mute and unmute their microphones. You also want to tell them if you're recording the session. So that way, again, if you run into an issue where you have an audio issue or someone keeps getting kicked out, everyone can rest assured this is being recorded, and if something happens, you can get the recording afterwards. You also want to take the time to set up the expectations for engagement. So like Katie did at the beginning, she said, if you have a question, put it in the chat box and we're going to address those questions during the Q&A period. If you've got microphones and you plan to take questions as they come in, you tell them at the beginning, raise your hand if you have a question or comment. Facilitator will call on you, will pause and address your question or take your comment. So this is the time to just, again, orient people to your platform, let them know what the expectations are for how they're going to participate in the session. So that way they feel more comfortable, and again, less frustration and a much better experience for your participants. And next slide. So the final step in delivery, so you've gotten through all of your webinar content, you've had amazing, interactive, engaging webinar, you've had no technical issues, smooth sailing because you did all the right things and planned ahead. You want to wrap up your webinar with an evaluation. So you want to have an evaluation for your participants so that you get a sense for how did things go. Did they get a lot out of this webinar? You know, is the content relevant to them? You might want to ask, did you have a lot of technical issues? So you can design your evaluation based on what you would like to know about how that session went. But you not only want to have a participant evaluation, but you also want to make sure that you do a self-evaluation. So oftentimes after a webinar, there'll be lessons that you learn. Sometimes you learn them the hard way, but that's okay. A lesson learned the hard way then can sometimes make you then a better producer, a better facilitator, and then you can create a better experience for the next time. So those are kind of the steps as far as delivering a webinar. But now we're going to shift over to what you do post-webinar, and I'm going to have Tracy Gill walk you through those activities that you do post-webinar. Go ahead, Tracy.
Okay, hold on one second. Okay, thanks, Shannon. Hi, I'm Tracy Gill, and I work for NOAA's National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science. For the last 10 years, part of my job has been to host NOAA's National Ocean Service Science Seminar Series, to support the One NOAA Science Seminar Series, and to support and contribute to a variety of other webinar series. Next slide, please. Sorry, I can't see it, so I need to see if it's there. Okay. After the webinar, follow up with an email thanking the presenters and co-hosts. This is really important because they've been kind of in isolation and they need to know, how did it get, how did things go? How were, do we have a lot of people? Connect with them. Tell them the number of attendees. They often want to know that. Tell them you will follow up with webinar products like the participant list, the recording, and webinar chat. Sometimes webinar chat has a lot of useful information in it. And it's sometimes helpful to have a quick post-webinar debrief, like prepping for your next webinar in a series. And then your next step would be to download and clean up those webinar products, the participant list, the chat notes, and clean them up. Next slide, please. Okay. As soon as possible, send the participant list, the recording, and webinar chat to the presenters and co-hosts. And if presenters approve of sharing those products, send the products to the webinar attendees and other post-seminar requests. I get many post-seminar requests afterwards. And a lot of times some people are able to post those products, like Katie posts her products, like the product today, the recording from this webinar will be posted on the library website. Post them if you can. You might be able to get them on YouTube, but you need NOAA resources and approval to do that. And first you have to make sure if presenters approve of sharing those products. And if they do, reply to all the attendees and other post-seminar requesters with those products. Back to you, Katie. Or over to you, Katie.
Thank you so much, Tracy and Shannon. I'm Katie Rowley. I host most of the library's presentations. We do a very kind of simple, bare bones using GoToWebinar. Listening to Tracy and Shannon talk, I am already learning a million things that we should be doing differently and doing better. So first up is talking about how to be a webinar speaker. So you want to recognize what you have to offer. So the first step is to really reach out, recognize what you have to contribute. You're an expert in an area that can benefit your colleagues or your team or project. You want to promote new research, they have a vital update. This is a great way to engage in collaboration across the organization or your community of practice. And this is just one avenue to do that, is to be a webinar speaker. The next step is to prepare. So do your prep work by finding the appropriate outlet for your presentation. Does your office host webinars that it would be appropriate for you to talk at? Do you want a larger audience? Do you want a very focused audience? Who can attend this? Is it proprietary, or is it something you want widely spoken about? This is the time that's best to think about preparing about your schedule, who you want to be attending this, and what would be the best fit. Is it a webinar or is it not a webinar? Is it more of a workshop that you want to do? But first things first is, recognizing that you have the expertise and that you have the knowledge to give and present on a webinar, and then reaching out to get that, getting that ball rolling. So the next thing I want to talk about is webcams. As you've seen, we are not using webcams today, and I'm going to tackle this first from a technical perspective, which Shannon did mention. One of the cons that I say trumps all other things is the quality of your presentation. Video requires a lot of bandwidth, as Shannon said, and if using it, your audio quality and your internet connection becomes very choppy or can lag, and we've all been on that webinar. So this is an indication that it's time to cut off the video component. And if you feel that your work environment, whether it's your home or your office, cannot support running a webinar, running a webcam on top of an audio and slides, I recommend erring on the side of caution and leaving the webcam off. Sorry. But then there are some other cons. If you have a messy environment, that could contribute to background distractions. If there's poor lighting, if you have some awkward camera angles. If you are, the only space you have is the dining room table and the whole kitchen's behind you, maybe don't put the webcam on. Also, if you want people to really focus on your slides, if the slides have some visual components that are very key to what you're talking about, you may not want to have a webcam so people are focusing on where you want their attention to be, which is on those slides. Lastly, on our list of cons would be if you really have some very detailed prepared notes that you want to be reading from, and you don't want to have to think about, okay, I'm going to maintain eye contact with the camera. You don't want people looking at the top of your head as you're, flipping through papers. So these are just some considerations for cons, but there are some very good reasons for using a webcam. It's visually engaging for the audience. They feel that they are in the webinar when they see the speaker. It personalizes the speaker, gives context to pauses. In some cases, watching a person's lips and or facial movements help the audience understand the content better. For example, those with a pronounced accent may benefit from a webcam so the audience can watch the speaker as well as listen, adding important visual cues. But remember, often your webinar will be recorded, like this one is, and shared, so the decision of a webcam can follow you forever. But then again, so can if you only have audio and you have a bad cold. So these are just considerations for webcams. It's a personal decision. Okay, next up, I'm going to talk about your slides. So another thing for presenters to think about is how they're sharing their presentation. Is it going to be a live presentation? Are you going to be showing a website or trying to demonstrate something? In webinars, often you are in either a training or learning environment, so slides become the preferred route of communication. So thinking about slides, keeping it simple is best, including engaging graphics, relevant imagery, with alternative text if you're providing the slides post-presentation to make sure they're compliant. Don't crowd the slides with text, use a clean font, use a large size to make it easier to read. Best practices often say don't embed video or animation as well, but if it is a central component to your presentation, you really need to check and see if your platform will support this. Most don't allow video, but some say it's okay and it works seamlessly, but you really have to try that out in the test run. I'm going to cover accessibility in the next slide. Your slides are only a visual representation of your webinar. You are actually the presentation. Engage your attendees with what you're saying and use your slides as context clues. There's a lot to think about in a webinar, but you really want to think you really want to think about using your voice and then your slides as just the context clues. Like this slide is saying, you want to be aware that your slides are visual. So you want to think about color blindness, for instance. You don't want to have a slide that is going to be the not effective slide down here, if you can see this. If someone is colorblind, this is going to be very difficult for them. You don't want to include graphics that use red and green as the only two colors. That is very difficult to see and it is not clear. This is a good accessibility point for Section 508 compliance, making sure your slides have high contrast. This is helping everyone see and understand better. Okay, nextly we're going to talk about sharing your screen and connecting your audio. So as the speaker or presenter, you have several decisions to make, as I've illustrated, but being a speaker is a collaborative process, as Shannan has relayed earlier. First, you have to ask who's going to be presenting those slides. Is it an option for you to run your own slides, or does the webinar host or the producer have to run those slides for you? So if you have the option to run your own slides, there are a few considerations, like whether you have notes that you want to be reading as well, or if you have maybe two monitors. Currently, I only have one monitor. So this is a consideration when I'm thinking about my notes that I have accompanying this slide. So that's why some people end up with a paper copy in front of them and they have to flip through pages. Other people have things memorized or they don't use notes at all. But if you have 2 monitors, you do have that option of having a presenter slide, so you can see your notes as well as no one else seeing those. So if you're presenting, you know, maybe the host is doing the sharing and you have to tell them next slide, as we've been doing in this. So that's just an added component. You need to remember to indicate to the person flipping the slides that they need to move on. And all this goes with the caveat that webinar platforms are not made alike, and how you share is going to be different. For example, GoToWebinar, which we are on, in my experience, has some trouble sharing Mac computer screens. So I don't have a Mac, I have a PC, and it is very seamless on how I share my screen. But if I have someone who is going to present and they have a Mac computer, those ones usually have a little harder time, and they have to go into settings and allow that sharing to happen, which can be pretty complicated. So that is why hopping on early and having those dry runs is really, really important. Also, you should be sharing your slides with your webinar host, the most final version you have. And this is really in case something goes wrong. I had a case where someone was presenting at Woods Hole and they had a power outage, and they were able to stay on the phone, but they had shared their slides with us. So we were able to continue the presentation, advancing the slides for them while they talked over the phone. But this is just best practice to have that available for your presenter, for your webinar host to have as well. My second piece of advice is to close all your background tabs and email. This is going to prevent pop-ups, notification dings, any other unwanted distractions that you don't want anyone to see. If you have a calendar event coming up next, you want to really close that calendar. Otherwise, you're going to have something pop up on screen that you don't want everyone to see, and you don't need that added background noise. Lastly, audio. If you're calling in, are you calling in on a phone, a cell phone? Are you doing it over your computer audio? I'm doing this over computer audio. And this is like in the dry run, what Shannon's discussing. The webinar host is going to help you choose the best, most clear audio option, whether that's going to be your cell phone, or if you have a headset, another type of external microphone, or if it's just the microphones that are built into the computer. The tips here are really just to check your mute options. If someone can't hear you, your computer just may be muted. They may be muted. Really run through those very simple basics first. Check your computer volume. Maybe you just have it down really low. And lastly, this happened to me yesterday. We were running a dry run with some presenters, and they had their Bluetooth hooked up to their headphones, and their headphones were downstairs in a completely different room, and they thought they could not enter into the webinar and have audio. So really just check those sources. Lastly, I'm going to talk about speaking and delivery. So this is slightly more subjective, but best practices include being dressed for the part. Using a webcam or not, it's never the moment to be caught in your pajama pants with a blazer on top. Okay, dressing the part helps you get in the right frame of mind. So think of a webinar as being on the radio or being on a podcast. You aren't trying to put your audience to sleep. Clearly enunciate your words, punch the important words with emphasis, and be passionate. For me personally, nothing is more engaging than someone speaking on a topic that they are passionate about. If you're giving a presentation, it should be something you are knowledgeable and enthusiastic about. Lastly, judge where your microphone is. Is it really close to your papers, or your paper's going to be sitting on top of your laptop and you're going to hear them shuffling around? You don't want that. Do you have a glass of water handy? You don't want your voice to immediately start to drop out. Also, you don't want kind of the water bottle crunching sound. So you really want to be aware of that, where your microphone is. If you have a headset and you know you have allergies, you have a cold, some of these things are really unavoidable. Maybe you want to acknowledge that. You want to say, hey, everyone, I'm sorry. I'm going to probably have to blow my nose in this because I have allergies or something. It humanizes you. It kind of acknowledges that this is a thing, but also making sure your headset is maybe slightly farther away from your mouth. If you've flipped it up over your nose or pulled it down further, just any way to get it kind of away from you a little bit, so you don't have any kind of heavy breathing or something that's really not wonderful to hear over a webinar. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tracy to discuss best practices for attendees.
Hi. So this is a minor point, but there are some best practices for attendees. Register for the webinar as soon as possible to make sure you get a seat, and then look for that follow-up email. If you have not used the webinar platform before, do the webinar check well before the webinar, not 5 minutes before, because that's often when you're downloading the webinar software. After logging in, if you can't hear, turn up your computer speaker or log out and back in. Enter your questions and comments into the chat, but understand the speaker may not be able to get to them all. And you can follow up online afterwards with them. They usually provide their email. And if you have an involved question that may take a lot of back and forth, consider following up offline. But most important, be kind and appreciative to the presenters. And so I think that wraps up our presentation. Back to you, Katie.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Okay, I'm going to get us to our thank you and contact pages, but we are going to try this poll, our next and last poll, final one. We're going to try this and see if everyone can participate this time. So I'm launching the poll. If your screen is in its maximum form, if you minimize the screen, you should be able to see the poll. That is what I'm hearing from several people online. So I'm hoping that's the case. So fiddle around, either make your screen maximize it or minimize it, see if you can get to that poll. So the poll is based on what you learned today, do you feel more comfortable hosting a webinar or being a webinar speaker? Okay, we've got 65% have voted. I'm really hoping to get us up to that, 100% if possible. If you are still having problems with the poll functionality, I understand. This is pretty much my first time using polls because we don't really do that with the library's presentations. So learning process for everyone. Okay, we've made it up to 76%. And 91% of you have said, yes, this is helpful. So thank you for validating that this was not a waste of all of our times. Okay, I'm going to close this poll and I'm going to share it because this is what I have learned during this webinar, that I can share all of the results with you. So hopefully everyone can see that and see that I have a 90% yes and a 10% still not sure, and I completely understand that. So I'm going to hide this now. Okay, and we are back on our thank you page. We have recorded this. We will have a PDF copy of these slides, and we will post all of those on the library's brown bag page. And next up, we are going to take questions, and I have been seeing your questions throughout. So I'm hoping that Shannan and Tracy will help me as well go through these questions. So the first one that I'm seeing from a while back at the beginning of the presentation was from David Fitch. And for GoToWebinar, do you prefer questions, chat, or both? Do you find that people get confused? I use mainly GoToWebinar, David, and this is Katie. And for our panel, for our attendees who come in, they are always muted. So the question and chat panel functions as one. So people do get confused and they are trying to send a chat to everyone in attendance, but what they're actually doing is sending it only to me. So I am seeing their chat and their questions. So it is sometimes confusing, but that is the functionality of GoToWebinar that we have. So if you put something in the chat panel or the question panel, it is going to the same place.
Katie, I would add, in Adobe Connect, we can use chat panels or Q&A pods, and Q&A pods can be visible to the attendees or not. And the chat, you can use a variety of chats for a variety of different things, and Shannan could say more on that if she wants.
Yeah, and in Adobe Connect, we use chat boxes. You can put multiple chat boxes on the screen, so you could ask your attendees multiple questions that are kind of open-ended and just get feedback and responses that way. It's a really great, they call it dueling chat boxes, but it's a great way to kind of have a conversation even though maybe your participants don't have a microphone. But again, you would need to base the use of those chat boxes on the content of the webinar and make sure it makes sense to use them at that point.
Great, thank you guys. I wanted to note that Claire Fackler had put into the question that it would be great to let everyone know that there is a NOAA Office of Education standardized evaluation question that we should all be using. Do you plan to integrate the content from this webinar into your work within the next year? A, I plan to use it. B, I'm not sure yet. And C, I do not plan to use it. And I have placed that in the chat for everyone to see.
Yeah, and I think most of the line offices, actually this is Shannon, they have their own standard evaluation. I know NOAA's Office for Coastal Management has a standard evaluation that we use after every webinar. So I think it would depend on what line office you have, what line office that you're in NOAA. If you're non-NOAA, then you would have to design your own evaluation. But most of the line offices within NOAA have their own standard evaluation. But yes, that is a question from the Office of Ed that is integrated into our standard evaluation after webinars as well. And we offer the opportunity to customize. So we have the standard questions, but if there's a few extra questions that we want to add at the end, just to get additional information that maybe isn't captured in the standard questions, then we do have that flexibility. So.
Great. Shannon, there's a question for you. Do you have a blank virtual agenda form that you are going to share with everyone?
Yes, I was planning on giving that to you, whoever is planning on sending out the post-webinar materials. So yes, I'm happy to share that.
I will be doing that. Everyone, this is Katie, and I will be sending out that along with these slides to everyone who attended today. So thank you for those questions. Okay, let me grab through. Does GoToWebinar allow breakout sessions? It does not, but Adobe Connect does. Correct, Tracy and Shannon?
Yes.
Let Shannon take it, yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, Adobe Connect does offer breakout rooms, and each breakout room is customizable. So you can have whiteboards in there, you can have just PowerPoint slides, you can have note pods. So there's lots of different ways that you could use those breakout rooms. And I believe you can use up to, I think there's a limit of maybe 10 breakout rooms that you can have. One of the things that is a small drawback to Adobe Breakout Rooms is that everyone has to be having their audio through the actual computer. So you cannot be on a phone line and use a breakout room in Adobe. So they're fabulous for small group activities, or if you need to have in your webinar small group discussions. Again, the breakouts are quick and very seamless as long as, again, the audio is all through the computer.
Great. I'm going to grab another questions. Do you have a recommendation either way? Should participants be let into the webinar early?
And this is Shannon. I'm going to grab that one first, and then if you guys want to add on. When I do a webinar in Adobe Connect, if they're going to be in listen-only mode, then usually I say, if they want to come in a couple of minutes early, fine. It's usually good just to make sure you do some quick sound checks. That way you can start at the top of the hour and not spend time when you should be doing the content trying to sound check. But if you are using microphones, then I recommend encouraging participants to log in 15 minutes ahead of time. Because not everybody is, again, as tech savvy. And each platform is a little different on how you might hook up those microphones, and you might have someone that just might have an issue with connecting the microphone, because as you switch platforms, your computer sometimes gets confused on, which microphone's available and what software you're in. So again, if you're using microphones, I recommend letting them in 15 minutes ahead, but listen only mode, you might want to let them in 5 minutes early just to, again, make sure everybody can hear and everybody's settled, and maybe they're doing that icebreaker activity while they're waiting.
Thanks, Shannon. That I wholeheartedly agree. Normally, I open the library's webinars about 10-15 minutes early, but everyone is in a waiting room in essence until I start the broadcast component of it.
I let people in just because I think people they see each other, they want to say hello. I think it's kind of friendly, but I know it just depends. If the presenter wants it more formal, we can hold, but I rarely do that.
Yeah, I believe the Adobe Connect has that kind of the chat functionality to have a conversation beforehand, which GoToWebinar unfortunately does not have.
And Adobe Connect does have a way for you to kind of put participants on hold. So if your presenters need to have a quick conversation about maybe a last minute logistic and you've started noticing participants coming in, you can put them on hold. They'll just get a little message that says, you know, this webinar is on hold. It'll begin in 10 or 15 minutes or something like that. So they know that they're logged in, but they're waiting. And then you just uncheck the box and then the room opens up and then they're able to hear. So it sounds like it's kind of similar to what GoToMeeting has.
Oh, and there's one other cool thing I just wanted to mention about, I just learned this about Adobe Connect. When you leave the meeting, you can drop in a URL for the people to go to if you want them to go to your project website or you want them to sign up for the next webinar. There's a way to do that in Adobe Connect, which is pretty cool.
And you can also link your evaluation as well.
Yes.
So as soon as you close out of the room, a pop-up window opens up if you're using like a SurveyMonkey or something, and then the evaluation will automatically pop up for people. So that way, you know, as soon as they're done, they can take the evaluation. Or you can also put the link to the evaluation in the chat box. And I also like to put it on the slide. So it's kind of like 3 different ways to try to encourage folks to give you feedback.
Shannan, can you share some of those evaluation stuff? I mean, Claire shared one question with us, but if anybody has evaluation forms they can share with, could they send them to Katie and maybe we can all take a look at those?
Yep, that can work. I want to grab a few more questions before we run out of time. And I do want to note that Barb has asked that no one is using Zoom, and that is correct, Barbara. Zoom is not allowed on NOAA platforms or computers at this time. So any thoughts on the ideal length of a webinar? Jerry, for the library, we always put them at an hour because we usually do them over the lunch break, a noon to 1, and we give people, you know, probably that 40 minutes to talk and hopefully 20 minutes for questions. That seems to be a good length, but honestly, good half an hour. Efficient presentations also work very well. Shannan, Tracy, do you want to comment on time?
Go ahead, Shannan, I'll go after you.
Okay. A lot of the webinars that we offer through OCM, NOAA's Office for Coastal Management, are usually anywhere between 60 to 90 minutes. And I feel like 90 minutes is a stretch because really it's to keep people's attention and keep it engaging. About an hour is usually what most people can spend. But if you really have a lot of content and again, you're really willing to create that engagement for folks, then you can stretch to 90 minutes if it's needed. But again, think about the objective, think about the content, think about what you're trying to achieve with that webinar, and that's going to help you decide what window to be in. But I think across the industry, it's 60 minutes or less is generally a best practice for a webinar.
I second that. People get bored. Nobody minds getting out of a webinar early.
Great. For evaluation, do you find that more people can access SurveyMonkey or Google Forms?
I mean, I've found it depends on your audience. We work a lot with the National Estuarine Research Reserve System, and a lot of those folks are state employees, and so access to Google can be difficult for those folks. So I found SurveyMonkey seems to be accessible to the majority of people, but again, I think it kind of depends on your target audience, and if you happen to know, like I know sometimes we're doing webinars where we're reaching out to the reserve staff, and so those I will definitely create in SurveyMonkey. But again, if you happen to know your audience, then yeah, think about accessibility. But SurveyMonkey seems to be accessible for a majority, but sometimes Google products are off limits to state employees.
Next question, do we have a NOAA account for Adobe Connect? Is that something that each region office division has to purchase?
I took a stab at that. I said, no, I don't think NOAA has one, but different line offices and different offices have one. For example, there's an NOS one, there's an NCOS one. Shannan has one for OCM. What do you say, Shannan?
Yeah, I think it's up to the individual line office. So for OCM, we purchased 6 licenses. So with Adobe, only the license holder can set up and run an actual meeting or webinar. I know that Tracy has a different type of license with her line office, and they do Adobe Connect seminars, and so they function a little bit differently. But yeah, each line office would have to purchase their own licenses in order to use Adobe. But I know that OCM, depending on if you're a partner or not, sometimes if you put in a request, one of our license holders might be available to help host an event, but it's not something that I think we can do constantly. So if you do have a need, if someone wants to reach out to me within NOAA, we'll see if there's a way that we can assist.
Awesome. Okay, next one. I'm gonna see what question we have. Ooh, this is a good one and may be the one to close us out. Which platform do you prefer?
Well, I don't know if I'll go first. This is Shannan. I'm a fan of Adobe Connect. A lot of folks are not huge fans of it because it is a software that is a little more complex, but it offers a lot of really great features and functionality. Again, there's different tiers of licenses that you can purchase. And so make sure if you are looking into using Adobe Connect that when you're talking about licensing, you ask them what features are available, because sometimes if you don't ask, you might purchase a license that you're not getting the features that you need. But it usually comes with polling. Again, you can do multiple chat boxes, you can have webcams going, you can do polling, and the polling is multiple choice, multiple response, short answer. So there's just a lot of great functionality, and you can set up layouts ahead of time. So that means you can create your virtual room and you can have layouts, one for each presenter, and have your polls preloaded and ready to go. And so it's a great software in my mind to host webinars and trainings, because you can set things up in advance and you can make it a little more interactive and engaging. And if you know how to set that up, it can be a really great experience for participants.
And I'll just add something quickly to the Adobe Connect thing. It is hugely powerful. It's like an Adobe Photoshop, but there is a steep learning curve, I must say. And Shannan Lewinski, who's been on, has rescued me many times with this webinar. How about you, Katie? What do you think?
Personally, since I work with GoToWebinar all the time, it is my favorite. It is a very, I want to say, kind of low tech, and it's pretty simple to use, but that does mean it has some drawbacks. But my experience with Adobe Connect has been a lot of technical issues, and like you said, Tracy, a lot of learning to do with it. And I find GoToWebinar to just be slightly more accessible.
Yeah, so I think it kind of depends too when you think about what platforms are out there. Just research, because different platforms offer different levels of licensing that you can purchase. So, you know, you might be able to purchase for, like, I think it's not GoToMeeting. What's the other one? I think it's GoToWebinar. Is that what we're using today?
That's what we're using today. There's also GoToTraining.
Oh, you know what else? I'm thinking of WebEx. Sorry. So basically, each different platform offers different levels. So there's like a basic WebEx, but there's also a WebEx where, you know, they've got all kinds of cool, like, polling things and, you know, different options that you can use to interact and engage your audience. I know on WebEx you can't set up the layouts like you can in Adobe. So just basically, I don't think that there's one platform that is, you know, superior to another one. I think thinking about platforms, you just need to think about what are the needs of your organization and the needs of the webinars that you generally do, and then think about, you know, what are the interactive elements that would help you get the best and most out of your webinar, and then choose a platform based on that. And then, of course, we all know, as if you're in a government agency, cost is also you know, an issue. But that is something that I think once you choose a platform and look at all the features that you want, then you can kind of decide if it's worth it.
Okay, everyone, it is 1 o'clock and I want to thank you all for joining with us and sticking with us throughout. I definitely learned a lot today. Even though I have been doing this for quite a while, I learned many things, and I hope you did as well. So thank you for joining us. We did record this. It will be up on the library's YouTube channel and also on our Brown Bag page. And I will be sending out an email probably in the next day or two about that virtual process attendee form, and also all of the recording. So thank you so much for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.